To begin this panel, I'm happy to invite on stage Nipun Mehta, founder of Blue Ocean Capital Advisors, who is one of the pioneers of wealth management industry in India. Nipun will also be moderating this session. Can we please put our hands together as we invite the panel on stage? Joining him is Arpita Vinay, Executive Director at Centrum Wealth. She's part of the core team that set up Centrum Wealth Management. Please welcome Rishikesh Parandekar, the CEO and NBFC and Private Wealth at Ambit. Joining the panel is Pradeep Dokania, a veteran in wealth management space. He's the Vice Chairman of Julius Baer India. Pradeep will be joining us in just a minute. And finally, we have Vishal Kapoor, Regional Head Wealth Management South Asia, Standard Chartered Bank. Vishal has been an active contributor to the development of the wealth management industry in India. With that, it's over to you, Nipun. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. As an industry, over the last several years, we've grown phenomenally. If you look at the overall wealth management industry assets, and it's difficult to put exactly a figure to it, but if you add assets across the mutual fund industry, across alternate assets, across insurance, the equity assets, I think we have a significant figure that a lot of us manage here. And I'm sure the audience today manages a significant portion of the wealth management industry. We've had several challenges in terms of the kind of growth that we've had. These challenges have probably ensured that, let me acknowledge, of course, the presence of Pradeep. These challenges have ensured that the overall cost correction that's required by the entire industry, by the various players in the industry, has needed to be constant, a constant as far as virtually all players are concerned. We've also seen several regulatory changes which have ensured that the overall profitability definitely comes under pressure. So on the one side, we've had significant growth opportunity in terms of increase in wealth within the country. On the other side, we've also had pressures on profitability. We've seen probably the influence of technology on the industry. We've seen changes in client expectations. I think a lot of that is something that we're going to discuss today and see whether we can do justice to the topic of growth and profitability. I'll probably start with Pradeep. Pradeep's, you've been a veteran. You've probably spent in this room the highest number of years in the wealth management industry, and you've seen all the ups and downs of various cycles in the equity markets, as well as all the challenges that are there as far as the wealth management industry is concerned. How do you see the contours of growth in the wealth management industry over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. In a way, I will start, the voice is there, yeah. By taking up, in a way, Rashesh very rightly summarized the macro backdrop, that what's the kind of market we are. And I think to start from some component, and maybe that will touch upon the kind of opportunity or potential or growth opportunity this business has. So we have a GDP of $2 trillion. We have a savings rate of 30%. That makes us the total savings of $600 billion. But out of that, I think household saving, which is what essentially wealth management industry can serve is 20%. So it's a $400 billion saving. And as he explained very rightly, in 10 years, we can go towards a $5 trillion economy. And even if we don't lose the saving, even it at 20%, it's going to be an expanding market. Even if it comes down to 15%, even then it will be a large market. So very clearly, in terms of future potential, the opportunity is there and expanding, and we are macro-wise, we are very well positioned. Talking about the past, in fact, the wealth generation in India has happened particularly after we opened up the economy from 91 or 92 onwards. And I think we have seen this economy, again, he very rightly mentioned that what was achieved in so many years was achieved in last 15 years, the $1 trillion economy. So in terms of wealth creation and the opportunity for management, wealth management opportunity is there. So we have gone, and again he rightly mentioned that there is noise and there is a long-term thing. We have grown despite all the, we are a very noisy and messy democracy, but we have grown despite all the challenges. And we hope continue to do. Maybe, so and again, the emergence of regulator has created a useful role. I think SEBI came, and maybe it has been inconvenient slightly sometimes, but it gives a sense of direction and stability. And I think touching upon the question of scams and all that, a regulator's thing gives a credibility in the long term. So maybe at the outset, I will, for all of us to give a framework to it, I can summarize this way that very interesting things are happening in Indian market which will have implication of wealth industry. Essentially, if we look at, we put money in 4 asset classes in India. And so largest one, incidentally, is real estate. Second one, perhaps can be gold and jewelry market, or the third one can be fixed income market. Maybe those two can be equivalent. And the fourth market is equity. So if you look at investment perspective, we are putting money in these 4 classes. All 4 classes will go. Today, my sense is, and they can opine, real estate is the biggest market. But interesting thing which has happened is the real estate regulation is starting now. So what has happened to equity markets, the way it has become, it has transformed itself compared to the market. I think maybe next 5 to 10 years we will see organized real estate market which will become investment worthy. In the second market, the gold and jewelry market also, interestingly, we have now started making it organized. For the first time now, excise duty is going to be charged on that. There were some local taxes. So maybe that also will move towards being an organized market. Fixed income market, all the mutual fund participants do know that I think some bit of arbitrage was taken away. So fixed income market has become organized, will grow from here. And equity market, maybe it is underrepresented, will grow. So all the 4 markets are now perhaps going to be organized and provide us interesting opportunity, despite all the short-term and long-term challenges, which I believe Rashesh summarized it very well. It will grow well. Okay.
So in terms of products, Rashid, come to you now. Maybe Pradeep mentioned about the various concentration of various products in terms of the opportunity for growth. Where do you believe in the next 5 years or so will be the opportunity in terms of growth, in terms of the products that we might have? We've seen AIFs come in. We've seen, to a degree, focus on insurance some time back. The focus with the equity markets rising has been more on mutual funds. Where do you think, over the next 5 years or so, will there be a maximum growth in terms of the products that we'll be able to offer clients?
Yeah, thanks, Nipun. Is this working? Yes. Okay. So before I dive into the specific question, just one perspective, right? I mean, we tend to look at macro numbers and we talk about 2 trillion and the savings rate and everything, which is all true at the sort of at the macro level. But the one thing to keep in mind also is a lot of the wealth increase that will happen will happen at all levels of society, especially at the lower ends, right, which will see increasing amounts of wealth and coming out of poverty. And so a lot of that money, eventually, from a wealth management standpoint, actually may not be immediately addressable, partly because there's a humongous gap in terms of sort of housing, for example, right? And so the real estate has two parts to it. Real estate for self-use and real estate for investment is very different context, of course. And so my anticipation is a lot of that sort of wealth increase will get absorbed in sort of housing demand, primary housing demand, right? And so it's not necessarily automatically come into sort of as an investment category. And so those numbers are always hard to quantify, but you look at all these data that's floating around which says, there is a 30 million housing unit shortage, if you will, in the 250 million sort of households that exist in India. And a lot of that stuff will actually take up a lot of the growing affluence, and which will be consumption, not necessarily investment. And so that's the perspective to keep in mind. So it's, just the compounding by itself is not going to be what the industry compounds at. Having said that, I'll come back to sort of the AIFs and all that, right? But my core belief is that, as Pradeep laid out, the 4 different components, from an investment standpoint, we continue to be significantly underrepresented in equities, right? And that is often the best hedge for inflation, the best way to sort of compound returns, the best way to sort of grow wealth. And so basic stuff, I expect that to go up in terms of just penetration of equities, basic things like SIPs. So it's not sexy, but I think that will continue to be a large part of where we will see growth. Right?
Through mutual funds?
SIPs largely through a mutual fund sort of context. So organized product, if you will, right? And that is, I think, the need for what needs to happen as wealth increases to get more money into what we loosely call the organized sort of sector. And I think that's where the biggest growth will be. The other growth, I think, will happen also in terms of the fixed income component. Today, fixed income basically is bank accounts, right? It's savings accounts and FDs, as what Rashesh called sort of bought product, not sold product. And so creating fixed income product, which is different and slightly more sort of tuned to better returns at sort of slightly higher risks, will also see a tremendous amount of growth, I think. So just creating more customized fixed income product will be my view about saying the sort of second big growth area. Again, the first 2 categories, real estate and gold, creating more investment product backed by real estate and gold as opposed to just physical, but will be another area which will see tremendous growth. So those in my reverse order, so equity, fixed income, and sort of real estate and gold backed products would be interesting. The alternate asset classes, so AIFs or otherwise, have a very small base today. So you think about AIFs, you think about structured products, whatever the case might be. And so from a small base, they will see tremendous growth. So if you think about percentage growth, that will be humongous, but per se, in an absolute amount sense, I think that will be the 4th largest per se.
Okay. Arpita, come to you now. Staying with the topic of, again, growth and products. Over the last few years, have you seen any change in client expectations on various products? Of course, a lot of us end up selling products to the clients. I'm sure there are huge client expectations on a certain kind of products, a certain risk that's allocated to products, a certain kind of return expectation that is there. Have you seen any change as far as these client expectations on products is concerned?
Before I sort of answer that question, I also wanted to make a specific point on the overall growth and profitability, if that's okay with you. So, it's cannot be overemphasized how macros support the growth story. Rashesh made a very strong presentation on that, and that I think got emphasized by what Pradeep had to say as well. But these are very interesting times, and I was just reflecting on the conversation that we were having before the session really started. On one hand, the macros look very, very stunning, very, very strong. And that's not something that could have been said about every economy. It's not 2007 anymore, where every single economy is in a hyper growth stage. So we are one of the few. But the other one was, there was this small banter that was happening before the session that if you were to have a drink on the number of outfits that have shut wealth management over the last couple of months or years, or especially over the last 2 years or so, if you had a peg for each one of them, you would be an alcoholic by now. So, so that's the other end of it. So there's an opportunity at one end, and there are business models that are not very, very viable. All of it may not be reflective of the opportunity that is there in India. There could be They are plagued by problems back home and stuff like that. But these are two very different ends of the spectrum. The opportunity sounds stunning, but the business models have not been able to take advantage of that. And I think that's really about three things, and with that I'll come to your specific question on what's happened on the products. One is, and that's the most cliched part, and I had a chance to glance through the EY report as well. Are the business models really customer-centric? We would like to think so. All of us have been saying that forever. But if you really look at it, and even amongst the top concerns for Indian investors, investors in India and globally as well, the issues on transparency, the issues on accumulation of products, duplicity of products in portfolios, continues to be amongst the largest concerns. Regulation has supported. You're seeing a model which is moving from, I wouldn't say that's changed at all. It's actually moving a Titanic and not a behavioral change that can happen in a single period of a year, but moving to trail-based fee models, moving to advisory fee models, moving to a little more financial planning-oriented model rather than saying that I'm a transactional product provider. So that's the first part of it. Changing of business models. The words have been there, the intent has been there. I think the execution has been very, very slow, and a lot of it depends on the people inside the room today. The second would be, if that is a model, what's the delivery and the attendant challenges and the talent and the issues on how much of it would be process dependent and stuff like that. And third, and the most important one, is ability to take a little more longer call on business, rather than saying, in our business, the cost of acquisition for the client is really very, very, very high. So, if the view changes on a quarterly basis, on a monthly basis, it's not going to be a business model that's going to be sustainable at all. So I think from a business sustainability, growth, profitability point of view, these really are the three levers. Your ability to customize your business model to the various customer segments, your ability to deliver it within the attendant challenges of attracting talent and work with it, and your ability to go beyond the immediate and take a little more longer term view of the business. Specifically on products, and it's not been 1 year, last 10 years have been 2007, hyper growth, China, US, Vajpayee era in India. 7, 8, 9, the world coming to an end. 9 to 13, 14, I'm oversimplifying stuff, but 9 to 13, 14, growth propped up by liquidity, and now searching for pockets of growth again. So it's not been easy on the advisors, it's not been easy on investors for sure, because you've lost the anchor. Anchoring of investment expectations, anchoring of asset allocations have all gone for a bit of a toss. So yes, from a products point of view, one of the other things that needs to be done and has been done, gets done a lot more for someone like us. I was a part of large format. We started this format about 5 years ago, and it's sort of scaled up well. Has been a lot more about downsides, a lot more about conversations about what could go wrong, a lot more about uncertainty rather than staying with product upsides only. And that's something that's sort of, that's helped. The clients have only grown. On the investment classes, I think there's a fair bit of flavor that Rishi and Pradeep have provided, so I'll sort of stay away from that. But anchoring investment return expectations is one of the most important conversations that's happened over the last 5 years, versus just saying, aap isme dal do and, maza aane wala hai. That sort of a conversation, people who've been a product of the bull market era, 3 to 7, 4 to 7, that conversation has significantly changed over the last couple of years.
Let me now come to the question of, or the issue of profitability, something that probably each one of us here spends sleepless nights on, whether it's a CEO, whether it's a IFA, whether it's a banker, whether it's a advisor or distributor. Vishal, I'm sure you would have spent sleepless nights on the kind of profitability issues that we've seen, either through regulatory changes or given the kind of costs that we have today. Where do you see profitability in this industry and the potential increase in profitability over the next few years?
Thanks, Nipun. I think, I think all great points made about the growth and the macro potential. But I think for most of us in the room, all advisors, it really boils down to, is it economically viable, and how do I make more money out of this? Because this is a profession. This is not any other vocation for us. And therefore, yes, absolutely. The economics of this business is absolutely central to what we are trying to solve for. There is a great opportunity, which is why we are all here. There is growth potential, which is why we've dug in our heels and stayed. But yes, we have to find a way to do this profitably. 3 points. I think, firstly, costs at some stage had gone to maybe a bit too much of an excessive. Arpita mentioned the sort of heydays before the GFC. I think it may be fair to say that they've moderated a bit. So therefore, expectations for people in the business are slightly more modest now, which is good. Technology has helped. So hopefully, if some of us are leveraging technology for servicing and many other things to bring down our own costs, then that has helped. But the challenge remains that at a top-line level, margins have compressed to a level where one is beginning to really question whether this is, how will this be viable? And that's where I think some organizations, some firms, some individuals, et cetera, made the choice that this doesn't look viable, and therefore let's exit and go. So that is an existential question, I think, for all of us. I think several models are emerging, which is good, because as one gets challenged, one becomes innovative, one becomes creative, and then tries to find a new way out. The model right now, which is one part of the portfolio, largely in the funds business, may be challenged. So let's look at diversification. Let's look at other products where there can be additional or equal value getting created, and therefore, at an aggregate level, this may still be sustainable, is one way of thinking. The second is, of course, that if you build scale, then even in the new context, with trailer commissions being much richer now than it were in the past, once you've got past a certain hurdle amount of AUM, it becomes very attractive. So that becomes another way to sort of look at our business. But both of these, by definition, what they do is, it's in a sense favoring the larger players, and it is favoring players who are more diversified than more concentrated and new entrants in a sense. Which would be the larger challenge, I think, in front of the industry, which is, while it may be sustainable and viable, and in fact, maybe even more profitable for the larger, more diversified players, how do you grow the industry at a more fundamental level by getting newcomers to come in? And the question I'd like to see answered is that if our industry cannot attract, let's say, a bright new graduate out of college to become a salesperson or a professional in this industry and take it up as a career, then how will this grow? If that graduate is better served by a tech company or a software company or a services company outside of our business, then are we really getting this model right? And of course, we all understand that there are huge dividends for the economy by getting this right. We all spoke about savers becoming investors, the counterbalance to FIIs. We talked about employment generation that this can really lead to, et cetera. So huge upsides possible, but we've still got to, I think, answer that fundamental question, which is how will you get the new IFA or the new advisor to set up shop and expand this from a diminishing pool of larger diversified players to an expanding pool of much more widespread, much more tier 2, tier 3 town type of advisors as well.
Sure. So Pradeep, as Arpita mentioned, several foreign institutions, foreign banks shut shop over the last several years. You've managed transition across various organizations, entities. You maintain profitability. You've grown assets consistently. Where do you think lies the secret in terms of increasing profitability? Is it bringing lower cost products? Is it lower cost people? Is it improved revenue growth that one can see? Where do you think the next leg of profitability will come from?
Well, I think Indian market is going through a churning. Just to give you a context, and some of us sitting here have linkages with international firms. Just to give you an example, Merrill Lynch today manages $2 trillion. And last year, their revenue from this business was $18 billion. Convert into that 90 basis points, which is the word called velocity. So for every asset, how much you are earning. Same thing will be applicable. He is ex-Morgan Stanley, 85. I now a part of a Julius Baer Swiss firm, 85 basis points. So I think that's the international norm, 85 to 90 basis points. The mistake some of us, particularly foreign firms, did in India, we started with the assumption that Indian market is ready to give 85 to 90 basis points or 1%. And all of us realized that it is not. Maybe we were in a different boat. We started as a domestic firms, so maybe we had better realization of that. And Rasesh mentioned some questions really that this comes with maturity and after earning credibility. So anybody who is looking at today that the Indian market is ready to give 90 basis points, I think my guess is will fail. And that has a deep implications on what's the cost base to start with. A lot of foreigners in India really started with international cost base and domestic revenue. And that's why it didn't work out. So we need to come out. I think profitability you mentioned. I think Indian investor, or we have not earned, why Indian investor? We have not earned enough credibility to get 90 basis points or 1% as advisory fee. We have to work towards that earning credibility. Talking about, I think just again to give a Rashesh's example, do we have acceptance of a doctor today? Or are we chemists? I think all of us go to doctors and pay 2,000 rupees fees very easily. And we don't ask or negotiate. But we go to a chemist and we are looking at discounts. So I think it's a process which is happening. Some of us will do. I think it will happen at what you mentioned, that it will happen at small level. We require people at every level. And I think what you mentioned about closing down, that is happening to all the industries. I think if you look at broking industry is also going through the churn. I was a part of investment banking after regulation. There used to be thousands of investment bankers at one time. And I think after that, so I think this industry also will go through a churn. We need to think about earning credibility, become like a doctor, and then some of us will become profitable. That's what.
So I think, maybe trust deficit is something that obviously seems to be one of the issues that is there. But yeah, Rishi, your views on profitability and how that trust deficit balancing that can be created as far as clients are concerned, how can that add to profitability?
So I'll continue my trend and comment on the earlier question first, again, go back to that, right? But the point, Pradeep, you made, the fact also is, a lot of the foreign institutions come in looking at these big numbers, right? And say there can be a big opportunity and big wealth potentially, right?
Forget about it. Anyway, go on.
The thing that always strikes me as odd, right? When even in Morgan Stanley context, we were talking about the whole Indian market, for example, will have lower assets for an institution specifically than, let's say, the Baltimore market, right? Or Baltimore office, so to speak. And that just is very hard for lots of foreign institutions to reconcile, right? The scale expectation and then the eventual delivery, which is always a striking thing, which realization comes later, right? But in terms of profitability, the challenges are humongous, right? And I don't need to repeat that. But the one other point which I will add to what Vishal talked about is the fact that the trend I see in terms of margins in the products, right? There is a fairly active regulatory scheme going on, right? So we always talk about death and taxes being the only realities in life. I think regulation is one more thing that is inescapable, of course. But the trend I see is that, there is a lot of sort of direction being given to what sort of economics can be earned. And that's starting today in mutual funds. It's, kind of been tried in insurance. And I think the progression is a little worrying, right? So I think one keeps moving from newer and newer to trying to go to newer and newer areas. But I would imagine that sort of trend continues, right? And doing this in a sort of blunt way across the segments and across sort of products will be sort of very, very, very disruptive. And that's going to be a big worry around sort of looking ahead 4 or 5 years. If we continue to see the trend, that will actually be worrying. And that is something which we as an industry will need to grapple with. Again, there are no easy answers on that. But the point you make about trust deficit, I mean, that's from a client standpoint, from an investor standpoint, ultimately the end goal for all of us is to try to be, at least want to be a doctor, right? Want to sort of be an advisor. And that's kind of eventually the right attempt. But again, the economic realities of our business end up sort of having us make compromises, which is where I think people have, our industry has done things which have led to clients disbelieving what that we will actually want to really be doctors, right? And then that is a trust deficit, I think, partly magnified by what happened in 2006, 7, 8, 9, for valid reasons, and sometimes sort of things beyond sort of the industry's control. I think has led to a significant problem, and that continues to be the case today, right? And so, just the question you were asking about client expectations, that the initial discussion always starts with a level of skepticism, and they push us to say, I don't really believe that you will actually be thinking about my overall good. I am really sort of interested in just show me something interesting, so to speak. And they force us in a way to push, to become sort of chemists, if you will. Right? And so it's a conundrum which is very hard to grapple, and there is no answer other than sort of sustained effort at a business model over time.
Sure. If you look at, again, staying with the topic of profitability and the overall revenues that get created, as there is more and more regulatory intervention, you're seeing lower revenues coming out of products. We've seen that from mutual funds. We still probably haven't seen it for maybe AIFs, PMSs. Over a period of time, potentially that's something that could come about. How do you then grapple with revenue growth when you look at your next 5 to 10 years?
So the profitability question is pretty, in a very oversimplified manner, is simple: revenue and cost. And I think, as Pradeep rightly said, a lot of times the cost equation was wrong. When MNC is looking at setting up shops, or large organizations wanting to get into a smaller format, but staying with the cost of a large organization. So cost considerations apart. On the revenue part, I think there are two things that have happened. The initial business models that were set up were conceived in an era which was the transactional income was very, very high. The product-based income was very high, was non-transparent, and therefore the ability to handle this whole transition from high upfront incomes to the trail-based annuity model, and that model is very beautiful after a couple of years, after you have a certain scale. But handling that transition of 3 to 5 years, that is perhaps, I think, becomes that's the highest mortality period. Now, the way we look at it in terms of ability to charge and go to your 75 bips to 85 bips, 90 bips sort of a yield on assets sort of a thing, clients will pay for it. In fact, a lot of our model is based on client paying up advisory fee. If you're able to demonstrate, and that's a very important, if you're able to demonstrate value add, and therefore taking the discussion, and that's relevant for larger client as well as a smaller client as well. What are the avenues to actually increase the returns within your overall risk return framework is a part of a discussion. But taking a step back and saying what should be the right structure for you, from an overall regulatory point of view, is there a succession plan in place? Do you have an administration in place? The geographies that you have monies spread in? Lot of the large pockets of wealth that's getting created is largely with entrepreneurs. For them, the considerations of that extra % of return, which is very, very relevant, but beyond that, being able to say, have I structured it right? Have I thought through the various geographies in which my assets are present? Do I have a basic will in place? Is my taxation sort of taken care of? And your ability to handle and in-source the skill in the organization to handle this conversation completely end-to-end makes it a lot more sticky. So yes, it's not going to be easy in terms of if you're seen as an intermediary who, provides the packaged products and expects to actually also investing in analytics. Your ability to say that the returns that happened, was it by fluke? It happened because the fund manager did a brilliant job. It happened because the investment advisor was able to take the tactical asset allocation calls right. And how do you attribute the returns that have come through? So these kind of conversations, your ability to dissect the information at this level, I think these are where we found the clients have stayed. Clients have wanted to increase their portfolio. So the conversation changes from saying that put in this money in here and this is what the mirror says last 8 years and 10 years and you're guaranteed to get this kind of return, to going back and taking a lot more holistic approach, which is also the approach internationally. That's something that we focus on in a very significant manner.
Let me now come to a bit on technology. And we've seen probably technology gradually playing a more and more important part as far as the business is concerned. Vishal, obviously as an international organization, you do get constrained by the extent of technology that you can use, given the global compliance issues that are there. How do you handle the way competition takes benefit of technology and how you may or may not be able to?
I think on the contrary, we benefit from some of the global best practices. So I wouldn't see it really as a constraint. And I think that the way we are learning all the time from not just what's happening in India, but what's happening across the world. And there's so many interesting things, exciting things happening in, for instance, places like China or Korea. And just an example, in China now, I think online purchase of funds is almost 80-90% of the market or thereabouts. So it's just telling you the sign and shape of things to come. It's just gone to that level. So paper is almost completely out. And of course, as we all understand, India is fast catching up with the proliferation of smart devices, as well as the comfort that clients now have of using online channels. So I think there is a continuous paradigm shift that we've been seeing. From earlier it being a way to disseminate information and provide service, to now being a way to transact, and then moving towards a way to actually receive advice, awareness, knowledge, and do your own research sort of model. So I think it's very interesting to see the transformation and the usage of digital in providing advice. Now, whether the Robo advisory model is actually going to grow in the format that we now currently understand in the international context, as well as the India context or not, or whether that will adopt and adapt to a different model for India is, I think, going to be very exciting. I know there's a panel later on in the day to talk about that. But the way we see it is that it's an absolute great tool and an advantage to have, which thankfully, of course, large organizations are well positioned to take advantage of. For the smaller individual players, I think it's also heartening to see that there are common platforms getting developed, which one can leverage to do this. But this is, I would say, a hugely exciting space to understand of how we can overcome some of the challenges that we talked about. That in the new world, if the regulator is looking at bringing overall costs down, and even with the current cost, distributors and advisors have a challenge with profitability, then one can imagine, with a lower cost, how will you actually be able to grow this industry? And I think we have to look at technology as one of the options of really transforming the way we're doing business.
Rishi, how do you view the technology and maybe extend that to robo-advisors as an opportunity or a challenge?
So I think a lot of the technology we talk about is pretty much sort of tweaking things at the margin, right? And increasing productivity at the margin. To me, sort of what will be disruptive in the next 10 years, which will sort of probably be a generational change. Hopefully, I'll be done working by then. But I think the new generation of investors and savers that's come about, the whole notion of self-directed investing, advisory, will actually change the business model dramatically. So even today, at the end of the day, we end up sort of thinking about number of advisors, how do you improve productivity, and that's kind of still the model, right? And I think that will have to change. And to me, it's not really robo-advisory. To me, robo-advisory, to oversimplify things, is really robo-advisory at the end of the day is a simplified product. But the overall sort of ability to create online advice, online wealth, there's so much information that is now available in terms of financial behavior of all individuals, right? And to be able to then craft something based on that, which is through lots of different things, machine learning, deep learning, right? And that the advances being made in that space are such of dramatic nature that I think that will fundamentally change the way we do business in the next 10 years. I think, and so I think a little bit, sometimes I feel like a lot of this discussion we have is a little bit rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic, right? And I think there'll be significant disruption, like there will be in banks, there will be in wealth by technology. And I'm not bright enough to know what it's going to be, but I certainly spend a lot of sleepless nights about that.
So significant changes as far as the business is concerned, huge opportunity out there. There are several more topics that I'd actually like to cover, including what are the different kind of pricing models that could be there, what's the impact of the direct applications and the increase in market share or wallet share of direct. What's the acceptance of the RIA model, the advisor model, and the kind of fees that are getting charged, various compliance issues, regulatory issues. I think several more topics that can be addressed. But for paucity of time, that's something that we'll leave it for a later time. Prem, do we have time for questions? So we'll have questions from the audience if there are. Please specify your name and organization and to whom the question is addressed.
Hello everybody. I am Sriyush Oswal. I am a founder director Alvin Finance from Pune. We are basically an IFA. Anybody of you can answer my question. What I can hear is we need to change business model. We need to be holistic, right? But for an IFA like me, who's a retail guy, manages small ticket size, running around here and there, the fund manager is not in my control. His stock selection, his ego is not in my control. The markets are not in my control. The US is not in my control. So what kind of holistic are we talking about? Can you just give me more details on that? Thank you.
Yeah, Pradeep.
No, I think things are in your control. I think you mentioned about a lot of things which are not in your control. My view is that if you know your clients well, what is in your control is asset allocation. That how much money to put, because I think you are selecting a fund manager because he's supposedly expert in that. From a longer term, he will manage money. So I think one of the key job I see for you is asset allocation. It can be strategic, it can be tactical, I think, but asset allocation is what you decide in consultation with client.
I agree on that. But there are a lot of things that are there. There has to be a change in business model. When we are talking about being holistic, there are very few things that is my control. Yes, the fundamental things we take care of. The asset allocation, the risk appetite, the risk profiling, the requirements, the time horizon. Yes, I would agree. But somehow I feel that there are not too many things. If there has to be a dramatic shift in the business model, especially if there has to be a fee-based business model, the markets are actually lot to do of things which are out of my control.
So, I just to answer that question, I don't want to undermine the challenge that possibly you face on a daily basis on ability to justify the fees that is to be charged to the customer. But frankly, in a business where if you assume 90% of the variables are not in your control, the ability to charge fees is zero, right? So I agree with Pradeep. The product performance may not be in your control, depending on who is sitting in the driver's seat there. But your ability to figure out the suitability of that, and ability to say tactically that does that make sense, ability to handle the asset allocation, even if you don't want to get into a lot of complex things which may not be possible at your end. If we are not able to do this, then there'll really be no basis to charge fees. So holistic or not, that is the, and I don't want to be sort of preachy about it. I'm a part of the same industry, and getting investors to pay up fees on this is the challenge that all of us face with. But if you really believe 90% of the variables are outside your control, then there is no value add that any of us are going to do. So I think asset allocation and ability to, so a simple thing like if the advisor did not exist, if I did not exist, and the invested on his own in a combination of whatever he thought was perfect, versus the inputs that came in and the active churn or not, what is the value add? Are you able to even demonstrate this, right? I think it'll be about or the product selection, the active allocation, so customizing it to the client for sure. That will be at a very, very basic level. And what I meant when I said holistic, for example, at our end as well, a lot of the clients don't start with saying that this is amount of money that I want to spend or save for a larger client. But it starts with asking the right sort of questions and saying, okay, so if there is a pot of money that, okay, I don't know if I have a pot of money, but I'm investing through a vehicle, and these are the 2 or 3 objectives that I want to meet. Are the vehicles right? Okay. If something were to happen tomorrow, is that sort of taken care of? So that's where, that's where a simple tool like, do you have a will in place? Do you have an asset register in place? Do you have a basic nominations? And these are not very complex stuff as well. In most of the cases where you have a nominee, they're not the ultimate beneficiary. They're just the guardians. Ability to pick up this and bring it in front of the client, I have realized in my personal experience with clients, that itself is perceived as a value add. So all of us will have to constantly look for things which is seen as a value add. Otherwise, you're right, in an environment where 90% of the variables are outside your control, it'll be very difficult to justify any sort of fees that we want to collect from the clients.
If I can just quickly add on one more perspective on this, and I'm going to provoke everyone a bit. I think the value that an advisor brings today is 10 times what we were bringing about 15 years back. And I'll tell you why I think it is 10 times. 15 years back, if you looked at, let's say, a large category like fixed income funds, the difference between the best performing fund and the worst performing fund, I'm just taking funds as a surrogate or an example, you would be struggling to get 100 basis points of difference between the two, the top performing and the average or the laggard sort of fund in a sense, right? The markets were so narrow, and the strategies could not be as differentiated in a sense. Now look at the same data for last year for the fixed income category. Look at, choose a time period, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, whatever returns for a fixed income fund, and see what your best performing fund returned and the worst performing fund returns. And I'm telling you, the gap is 10 times, which means that the value that an advisor could bring in choosing the right product at the right time is actually 10 times. As in, you could have made the big difference between the right product at the right time versus actually a very, very narrow margin that people had to deal with 15 years back.
That's a very, very potent point, Vishal, that you make. That's so true. Especially now over the last couple of years, the bunching of returns is actually very, very disproportionate. So forget even the best performing and the worst performing. You were not very lucky to pick out the best performing or the worst performing. But the average quartile, top quartile and bottom quartile, there's a significant amount of performance dispersion that's there. And that is the reason why financial intermediation is relevant.
In fact, to add to that, it's not just about that performance in the top quartile. 15 years back, there used to be, even if your debt allocation used to be there, you probably had only a liquid fund, an income fund, and a gilt fund. Over the last several years, you've had probably even purely in debt, you've got 8 or 10 different kinds of funds. More importantly, the kind of ratios that are there and the kind of maturities and duration that is there is obviously adds to the inputs that an advisor can give. So I think that asset allocation point itself is significant.
Maybe I will just add one more thing. In fact, just to give you a sense, my view, and may be wrong, I think you are in a better situation today because of what we discussed about technology. The access to information is now significantly easier for you compared to, say, 10 years ago. And if you use that and manage asset allocation and other thing which we sort of indirectly talk about is client expectations, that you can manage. Ultimately, asset classes give some bit of return over longer term period. But I will say, I think in this industry, somehow I feel that there is going to be significant role for people like you. Because you know your clients better, you can manage client expectations, and you can talk on sort of advisory linkage with them.
Hi, this is Deepak Khemani here. This is taking off on Vishal's point which he just made. I have another question, but I'll take that later. Vishal said that example of 15 years ago, if somebody was advising, he had a very limited choice to give to the customer. You also said that if you take a list of debt funds in the last year and compare between the top performing and the bottom performing, and if it was an advised portfolio, the assumption here is that the advisor knew that these top funds are going to stay in the top quartile, isn't it? Is it possible?
I think, as in the frank answer would be yes. I think that is part of what the advisor is expected to do, which is, do a lot more research. And coming back to the point that Pradeep made, doing this 15 years back was far more difficult than it is today. So I think with the availability of information we have now, I think more fundamental areas where we add value does put a lot more burden and focus on things like allocation and quality of products, and not just historic returns, but what we think this fund is likely to do in the future. Now, of course, it's not an exact science as yet, but that's, I guess, one of the areas where the advisor has to add value, which is where I think your interaction with the managers of the product, the comfort that you have with that AMC over a period of time, some amount of experience, et cetera, all plays up. But really the point I'm making is that earlier, with a 1% difference between the best and the worst, how much value could you add? But now, justifying a 1% fee when the difference in the fixed income category can be 10%, in equity, for large cap equity, the difference can be 30, 40%. Then our ability to charge a fee for the value we provide should be relatively easier, is the point.
So since morning, this comparison of advisor becoming a doctor and not being a chemist has come up thrice, since Rasesh mentioned, we also took up this point. A doctor can dispense, a chemist cannot prescribe, right? To become a doctor, you need to pass out from 5 years of studies and 8 years of experience, only then you will be able to prescribe and dispense. A chemist just sits at a shop and starts, selling medicines over the counter. What the regulator is trying to tell us is that all of you are now chemists, please become doctors, without going through that 5 years of studies and 8 and 10 years of practice. How is that possible?
I don't know about a formula where it can happen. You have to give 5 years to this.
I mean, experts on the panel,
Here are a couple of perspectives. Let me, may I? The thing is, so there is clearly a lacuna today in terms of the accreditation, right? The industry needs accreditation. People have tried different approaches. The CFP has tried an approach, multiple people have tried approaches. But at the end of the day, it comes down to something which is fundamental to an advisor, right? And the tone of the questions or some of the discussion we're talking about is, if the belief is not there that we can create something, we can add value to clients, right? Either through picking, allocating assets better or to picking better funds or whatever. If that belief is not there, then this is the wrong profession, guys, right? Honestly. So, and then what one needs to do to be able to get that, maybe we can wait for sort of the industry to come up with an accreditation sort of thing, and we go through a 5-year or whatever the number of years it is. But fundamentally, one has to believe that one is creating value and adding value to clients. One is being an advisor, right? Even if you're a distributor, you have to be able to believe that you are adding value. If that belief is not there, guys, I think it's time to find something else to do, seriously. I'll stop there. If you want to add anything to that.
Okay, no, I think it's very difficult to disagree with the point that you make. Just because I think I'm a doctor, I may not be a doctor, right? So yes, the larger point of saying that whether the industry is mature enough to say that there's certain amount of accreditation, grooming, testing of information, because we live in a very dynamic world, that should be a bare minimum standard. I don't think we have come to that. It hasn't come. That conversations haven't come to that. Various organizations may have evolved their own internal benchmarks and stuff like that. But compared to, if you want to be in a situation where you produce your visiting card and are able to demonstrate with saying that I have invested in, I am equipped to, and I constantly keep myself on my toes to ensure that I'm able to provide the right advice to you, I don't think we've matured to that. And that's a very, very relevant point.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a very interesting discussion on growth, profitability, opportunity, obviously regulation. Let me thank all my panelists, Vishal, Rishi, Arpita, and Pradeep, of course, for enlightening all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.